Hello everyone and welcome to this week's video. This is part 2 of how I paint wood in watercolor, and this week we're working on this wooden spoon. The materials I used are Arches Rough 140 pound watercolor paper, M. Graham watercolors, Mission Gold watercolors, a selection of small watercolor brushes for detail, a Prismacolor Color Ice pencil in light gray, and a Staedtler eraser. For a complete list of all the materials that I use, please check the description box down below, and for a more in-depth description, please check my previous video on how I paint wood. That video uses the same colors, tools, and techniques that I use today, but on a flat wood segment. Now to get started, I'm using a larger brush and I'm putting down my first flat wash of color. I'm using a little bit of yellow ochre and another brown, kind of like a burnt sienna or something like that, but feel free to use your reference photo for your best judgment on what color you should use. Now I'm going in with a smaller brush and I'm using a more concentrated mix of my brown, in this case burnt sienna, and I'm creating kind of a shadow area of my spoon. This is so that I can have a really strong idea of where my shadows are and where my curves and shadows and my details will start. This won't be relevant for every image, but it was in mine. If you're curious about what shadows or what colors you should leave in with yours, really just get to know your reference image, and if it's easier, try to pick something that has some darker shadows so that you don't have to worry so much about putting those in. And now I'm going through and I'm getting started on my shadow area. Since this is a spoon, I do have this slight curved shadow area that I really want to emphasize, focusing on the outer edge and kind of blending inwards. This is more of a harsh shadow, so I didn't really blend that out all too much. And then I knew that one side of my handle was going to be more in shadow. Now, this is my first layer of color, and I know that I'm going to end up darkening this as time goes on, but this is a really good base, and it's perfect for people who are beginners so that you can kind of start to put in your shadows, and you know that you can darken them later on in case you mess up or you get a line wrong. Now, once that is dried, I'm going in and using the same small brush. This is a number 1, I believe, and I am putting in my grain lines for the spoon. This is a really great example of following your reference photo and just painting what you see. If you are more comfortable, you could easily put these details in pencil beforehand, whether it is like a Prismacolor or a charcoal pencil. Keep in mind, if you use graphite, it will most likely end up smudging, so keep that in mind. That's why I use Prismacolor. Or you could use a watercolor pencil and it will just kind of blend into your painting. I'm going through and I'm painting the grain of my spoon, and I'm just being really mindful of my reference photo, the spacing, the curvature, how it reacts with the shape of the spoon or the object that you're painting. And after that, I go in and I just want to darken the inner part of my spoon, since it is going to be darker, and once it dried, I start in on the grain details of my spoon. Now, as you can see, my spoon does have a lot of really circular grain patterns, so just getting those curves right and paying attention to the width of the lines and everything else was important to me. Again, if you have issue with doing this freehand, you could always do these lines beforehand in something that you feel more comfortable, or you could even do a base drawing somewhere else, like in a sketchbook or something like that, and just kind of get the feel of the grain and how it moves. Now, if you decide that you're not going to be following your reference photo entirely, or you are combining a couple of reference photos, just really kind of get to know your grain pattern and how it moves and how you would like that to be represented in your painting. You don't have to follow your reference photo completely down to every last detail. I'm simplifying the wood grain quite a bit in this, mainly because I don't want to have to paint every small detail, and I think that you can really get a strong idea of what this object is and that it is wood, and I just think you have a cleaner image by not having every single small tiny line and detail and grain shown up in this painting. So you can also see that I'm going in and I'm putting in these horizontal lines in the background. This spoon did have a couple of different oddities in it, and I just wanted to show that. I'm not going to be darkening that going forward, but it was in my reference and I did want to put that in there. Now, since my handle is dried, I'm going in and I'm taking a darker brown, most likely a burnt sienna, which I used with the majority of my painting, and I'm mixing it with a little bit of sepia. And I'm really starting to darken that outer edge and the inner portion of my spoon where it's going to start to be in shadow. And I'm using a really, really fine detail brush. Now, this is a brush that I got in a multi-pack of brushes. It was really, really inexpensive, and I got a ton of brushes. So they're not marked. I don't know the size. I just know that it's really tiny, and it's most likely 3/0 or smaller. I will leave a really good recommendation down below after I compare it to other brushes that I have that do have some sort of marking on them. And as you can see, I'm having some areas be really thick with my my shadow lines, and I'm making some areas thinner, just paying attention to how the light is going to hit the object. And then while that dries, I go in and I darken the inner portion of my spoon again. Now, doing stuff like this, it does help to have a really good idea of how light works with your object and in your photo. If your photo does have really flat lighting, then having some sort of reference where you can look at and kind of interpret the light and help you understand it. Another trick of mine is to put an object in the corner where you want your light source to be. This helps me imagine where the sun or light source would be, so I know what portion of my object would be in shadow. So that's what I do. That's kind of my little hack, and that's why at times you'll see me stick like an eraser or something at the corner of my paper. That's just because I'm creating a light source. And also, where you place your object is really important, and you can either visualize it being a very direct sideways light source, or just imagine it kind of upward in the sky like a sun or a light would be, where it's above it, and you can imagine how the light would hit it at that point. But having a really good idea of how light works, and by studying images and practicing your painting, will really help you kind of hone that skill in the long term, because it can be something that over time it just starts to feel a little bit natural the more that you do it. It's not really, especially if you were creating a light source, it does take some intuition on your part and just some practice. So once I finish darkening up some of those edges, I'm going in and I'm using my really, really small brush again, and I am darkening a lot of that grain pattern since I lost it, and adding a lot of those glazes over the top. Now, if you see that this is happening with your painting, and any painting that you're doing, don't worry about it. A lot of the time, not all of that paint is going to lift, so it will still be there. You will still see some, markings of it. If you find that you've put down a couple of glazes over the top of your details and you're really starting to lose them, then I would say take a break, let it dry, go back in, darken up that detail before putting in any other glaze. If you are someone who works more directly and can finish a painting without doing as many glazes as I do, then this won't be as big of an issue. But for me, that's just how I work. It's how I'm most comfortable. I've tried on so many occasions to work with less glazes, and that's just not how my brain works. So do whatever feels most comfortable to you. I have these tutorials to kind of help you figure out how to tackle different objects and talk about things like color, lighting, shadows, techniques, stuff like that. I want to have these videos be a foundation of knowledge, but by no means am I saying that this is the only way to do it. These are the only colors to use. And with things like techniques like glazing and stuff like that, if that's not how you are most comfortable working, if that's not how your brain works, if you can look at something and be like, I need it to be this color and this dark, and you can skip all of these steps of glazing, by all means do that and really just hone your own style and your own techniques. By all means, don't feel like you have to follow me or any other tutorial to a T. So you can see that I am going through and I'm just very carefully darkening all of these grain lines. Some of them were lost in the shadow, so I'm just kind of going through and doing my best to put down what I think looks natural, what I think looks best, and in some cases some of these grain lines did end up changing a little bit, but I really don't feel like the illustration suffered from it, and I really ended up liking the final product anyway. But you can see that I'm just going through and I'm doing all of these grain lines, and I'm making sure to be really careful about it, really slow, because with something like this, I really didn't want to have these weird kind of wobbly, uneven, or feathered lines. And with some of these, since they are in shadow, you can see I'm going in and I just made a slightly darker version of my brown that I was using. And that is really intuitive in how you decided to do it and how you created your shadows, but you can see that I'm darkening the grain that is in shadow. And then while that is drying, I'm going in and I'm starting in on the grain lines that are on the handle. Now again, I'm going to go through and I'm going to do my entire grain line pattern, and then I will go through and kind of darken areas afterwards where I see fit. However, this would be a really great opportunity to do more of a wet on wet style. If that's something that you like, you could put down your base color, and then while it is still wet, you add a darker color that will kind of flow through that first section or the section that you want that's in shadow. And that's a really beautiful kind of watercolor-esque way of getting that gradient. It is something that takes a little bit of practice, especially if you want something that looks really cohesive. Getting your water control correct will have a big impact on how far your watercolor spreads, which is the main reason why I don't do that. I feel like it's not a strong suit of mine, so I prefer to glaze and to blend. And you can see that in this painting, the grain pattern did end up changing a little bit over time. You can see that they started really thin in the base of the handle, and then they got wider and slightly more curved, and then you ended up with these lines and then eventually these curves down at the bottom. And this is not something that I imagined. It was in my reference photo, and you can see in some areas I have these lines that are leading to the larger part of the spoon that really don't seem to line up with the grain pattern in my actual curved part of my spoon. But when you look at it at the end, all you see is the grain pattern and how pretty it is. And I really like it either way. So feel free to, follow your reference or references and to do what you feel looks best. Now, something that wasn't in my reference photo, but I did want to do, was create just the slightest bit of shadow on the outside of the opposite end of my spoon. And I feel like even though this is a very subtle step, it really went a long way into creating that little bit of depth and detail that I wanted in my spoon. Since it had a really kind of flat light to it on one side, by creating that slight shadow, it created a more roundness to the handle. I really think it helped convey the object a little bit better. So here I am just kind of putting my finishing touches on a couple of darker areas and emphasizing some of my shadows. And that is really it. That is the illustration, and that is all for this video. I hope you liked it. I hope you found it helpful. I hope that if you did enjoy it, please like it, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below. I read all of your comments and I try to comment back to everyone. They really do make my day. And if you want any more information on how to paint wood or wood textures, please check out the part 1 to this video, which is me painting a segment of a cutting board, and it's really helpful as you can see me doing this with a really flat surface with no curves or shadows in it. That is all for today and for this video, and I will see you all next time. Bye!